Alright, welcome to module 11. In this module, we will go through the step 3 of life cycle assessment, which is the life cycle impact assessment. So, in the life cycle impact assessment, what happens is that most of the life cycle inventory that we have collected so far or we have seen so far are mostly the raw flows in terms of emissions or in terms of resource consumption. So, now what we want to see is we want to convert this into actual or specific impacts on the environment. This is where we are actually connecting our technical systems impact on the environment in terms of decision making matrix. So, look at the life cycle impact assessment definition. The purpose of LCIA is to provide additional information so that we can use the LCIA results and help understand the environmental significance of this in terms of natural resource and environmental releases. So, if you have taken a traditional risk assessment course, this is different than traditional risk, in the sense that your traditional risk is actually focused on directly assessing the impact of chemical releases. So, for example, if you have worked in a chemical plant, you know that the risk assessment of any potential emissions or spillovers is a routine part of our study. In that, what we are doing is when the spill happens, we really want to understand the actual exposures and all of that to actually calculate the impact. But in LCIA, we are not really doing that. So, how is LCIA or life cycle impact assessment different than risk assessment? So, in case of risk assessment, what happens is we generally do a detailed mechanism based model to develop and predict impacts of the chemical on the population exposed. It can be both human or animal, and even we can predict the probability of population being impacted by the emission, which is the hazard or hazardous emission exposure. For example, we can have an aquatic food web biomagnification model that can simulate how inorganic mercury gets deposited in the fishes, in the fish tissues, and then that model can actually predict the probability of tissue mercury concentration. Thus, what happens is that you can relate the water quality issue to the fish tissues through this very detailed biophysical model. Such models use physical flow laws, or in case of fish model, they will understand or they will use the partitioning laws of the toxic chemicals in the fish tissue versus water and also the time of exposure to calculate the risk values to the fish population. So, here you can see that there is a very detailed study of every environmental flow on a specific impact by understanding the physico-chemical characteristics of the exposure and how the species or the environment may relate or behave in that exposure. In case of LCIA, we actually do not follow that rigor. That does not mean that LCIA is not based on actually rigorous model, they are. But to make it simpler, because we are dealing with large number of flows in LCA, we use ready-made characterization factor. So, what that characterization factors are, those are kind of empirically derived factors that are used, that are brought in from accepted models within each of the impact categories. Hence, when we are interpreting life cycle assessment, so if someone presents their life cycle impact assessment results to you, you remember that the absolute value of LCIA results are not absolute or precise risk, they are potential risk. There is integration of environmental data over space and time. So, since we are not actually studying where actually that spillover happened, what is the actual location or the actual time, which happens a lot in the risk assessment, here it is more of a potential aggregation of all the data and gives an empirical characterization factor or even the modular characterization factor, but that is mostly the potential impact. And the fact that even though you are assessing impact from emissions occurring in the time that you are studying, but the actual impact may actually occur in future. So, it is not happening today, it may have happened in the past or may happen in the future. So, your impact assessment is not really absolute impact, but it is more of a potential impact analysis or what may have happened because of that particular flows. So now that we know how risk assessment or impact assessment are different, because a lot of time for decision making in terms of environment, people do a lot of risk assessment, but in impact assessment, it is a little different strategy. Then why do we actually do LCIA when we already have such rigorous risk assessment methods available at our hand? The main reason is we have too many materials and too many emissions. We saw an example of network for process LCA which only had 2 processes, but we may have 100 of different processes and we may have thousands of flows in our life cycle inventory. When that happens, it is very difficult and tedious to actually do a very detailed risk assessment. We also may not have all the information available to do a rigorous risk assessment. So that makes our LCA a highly multivariate decision making if we use each component of LCI individually. So imagine doing product footprint for thousands of different products with so many emissions, and if you do not have a concise way of actually aggregating or reducing the dimensionality, then it will become very tedious and actually becoming impossible to make a decision for different products. So the main motivation of LCIA is to reduce dimensionality and aggregate the life cycle inventory components into fewer categories that we call as impact to make decisions simpler. And actual connection of processes with environmental impact actually happens in this stage, because for each of the flows now we are going to assess what are the potential environmental impact for each of these flows that are included in your life cycle inventory. And that is basically one of the methods to reduce dimensionality. However, there are some other methods to reduce dimensionality in LCA that we will also study in this course. Few of those univariate metrics are footprint. So we will learn about carbon footprint, water footprint, nitrogen footprint, ecological footprint, and also what we call as thermodynamic LCA. In thermodynamic LCA, instead of looking at flows and resources in terms of mass, we start studying everything in terms of energy and exergy. The life cycle impact assessment categories are actually defined by the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry and is given into ISO 14000. All said and done, LCIA is a very convenient method because it is based on actual science of the potential hazard, but it reduces the dimensionality and does not require the rigor and the tediousness of actual risk assessment. So let's see what are the steps in life cycle impact assessment. In this third step of LCA, we have 3 main or mandatory steps. First is the impact category definition or selection. Second is classification and then characterization. The other few of them are actually optional as given by the ISO, which are normalization, weighting, grouping and data quality analysis. Of these we will study the 5. So, we will study the 3 mandatory and the 2 optional, normalization and weighting. So, let us look at the steps mandatory in ISO 14044. So, the first one is selection of impact categories, category indicators and characterization models. So, in this one you are mainly selecting which characterization model you are going to use. So, which LCIA method you are going to use and also the impact categories. The second step is classification, which mainly means that we are mapping each of our LCIA component into different impact categories, and these impact categories are mainly selected in the first step of selection based on the impact assessment method that you are going to use. The third one is the characterization. Characterization is an actual conversion of your mass flows from the LCIA of emissions and resources into the impact that you are studying. So, some components will have higher value for certain impact while lower value for different impact category. An example is the impact category of global warming potential in terms of CO2 equivalent. So, if you have read any climate change impact report, most of the places it is being reported in terms of global warming potential, which is the actual potential impact of that particular pollutant in contributing to global warming. So, that is the impact category. When we have different components like carbon dioxide, N2O, nitrous oxide, all of this may have different characterization factors. So, CO2 has a characterization factor of 1 for global warming potential, which means 1 kg of CO2 is actually contributing to 1 kg CO2 equivalent of global warming potential, and that makes sense because your reference frame for global warming potential is carbon dioxide. N2O on the other hand is 300 times more potent for global warming potential. So, it has a characterization factor which is 300 times that of CO2. So, N2O is actually 300 times more potent than CO2 for global warming. While we are focusing a lot on decarbonization and CO2, we can see that if we are serious about the global warming potential for the climate change, N2O is an equally important component. And that is why these kind of assessment helps us identify the areas where we need to work to actually make a change in the impact category that we have selected. The fourth one is normalization. Normalization is mainly about changing the absolute values into relative values. So, what it does is that it uses a reference or total value to calculate the level of contribution in each impact category. So, we will see about how normalization is done when we get to that step. But the idea is that we want to normalize so that if we have certain products with really high impact and certain with low, we can normalize and see the relative contribution using the same average baseline. The next step is weighting. In weighting, what we do is that we have several impact category, but then we weight, we give certain weights to each of the impact category to aggregate all the impact categories into single number for decision making. However, it is still controversial because valuing one impact category over other is subjective. For example, if you are studying global warming and abiotic depletion, abiotic depletion is an impact category that relates to the depletion of non-renewable resources in our economy. So, for example, depletion of fossil fuel sources. So, the question is global warming more important than abiotic depletion? Maybe or maybe not. So, that becomes subjective. Is human toxicity more critical than ecotoxicity? That is also not really clear because of course we can say that human toxicity has to be higher ranked, but that is a very anthropocentric or human based view. We might actually as well work on preserving biodiversity, and hence ecotoxicity becomes equally important. So, when we weight, we actually give some weights to each of these and then we combine them into one single decision matrix. Okay, the selection step is really simple. You select the impact categories, category indicators and characterization model, and when we go into the characterization model, you will see what options you have. But this step is mainly about picking the impact assessment method that you are going to use. Classification of LCI into impact categories. Here is an example. So, you have impact categories given. What you do is that you select each of the emissions may have a one-to-many mapping, which means that each of your emissions and resources may be contributing to multiple impact categories. So, for example, you have for climate change, we have CO2, methane, N2O and CFC. For each of the impact category, you also have an unit prescribed. The prescription of unit is actually based on the reference chemical that is used to actually see what is the impact. So, for example, for global warming potential, we are using kg CO2 equivalent. We will also see the characterization model for global warming potential, and then it will become more clear why we are choosing the unit. So, unit is mainly selected by using the chemical that is used to actually develop the model for quantifying the impact in that category. So, for global warming potential, we have used CO2. For ozone depletion, we have used CFC, which is the chlorofluorocarbon, because CFCs are known to cause damage to the ozone layer. So, all the gases that cause loss of stratospheric ozone depletion, CFC, HCFC, those will be mapped to the ozone depletion. Then we have what we call as acidification, and here you can see the unit that we have used is kg SO2 equivalent. and KgSO2 equivalent because sulfur dioxide is what is causing the acidification in the marine or freshwater ecosystems. So, the selection of the unit is based on an actual chemical reference that is being used that is known to cause that impact in the environment. For abiotic resource depletion, we have metal, fossil fuel, and it is mainly the equivalent amount of mass, and also the energy depletion is in terms of energy. So, when you select the method of the impact assessment, you will see the different impact categories. You will see which of the life cycle inventory in your LCA are actually being mapped to that particular. So, this is your where you are classifying your LCI into different impact categories, and you are selecting the indicator unit based on your impact category that you are selecting. So, that is what we call as classification of LCI into your impact categories. Next is the midpoint and endpoint impact categories. So, see, we have midpoint means that we have multiple impact categories that we are taking. From the midpoint, which is the impact category, we can go into area of protection, which we call as the endpoint indicators. So, here you can see you have all the LCI results which are classified into different impact categories. The impact will be transferred by the characterization factor. We will see how we calculate that characterization factor and how we use that to convert the LCI into impact. And then the third step, you can go all the way to the end point by looking at whether you are interested in understanding how human health is being impacted, how natural environment is being impacted, and how natural resource consumption is being impacted. And for that, we use damage models. So, let us see an example of characterization. We have, this is an example LCI for a sample LCA. We have different emissions, CO2, carbon monoxide, NOx, SO2, and the quantity is given. So, we are assuming that this quantity is being calculated for the LCA scaled up for the final demand that you wanted to study. And then in yellow highlighted are your impact categories. So, we have 4 impact categories that we are going to basically focus on for this LCA. So, global warming potential, ozone depletion, human toxicity and acidification. And then what you are seeing here in this box is what we call is, in this box is the characterization factors. So, characterization factors are basically told how much is the contribution of per kg of your selected inventory into that category. So, what this tells is that your CO2 has 1 times impact or contribution to impact in GWP, but CO2 does not in this particular impact assessment method, it does not have any characterization factor for ozone depletion, human toxicity or acidification, which means that CO2 is not going to contribute into these categories. Carbon monoxide is contributing into human toxicity, and you can see that your NOx is contributing both into human toxicity and acidification. So, when we calculate the total impact in each category, what we do is we are multiplying the amount 1.792 times 1. The total impact or affected scores for global warming potential is 1.792, and the unit will be kg CO2 equivalent. That is the reference chemical that is used for global warming potential. For human toxicity, similarly, we can for ozone depletion, we can see we have 0 impact because none of our chemicals are actually have a characterization factor for ozone depletion. And for human toxicity, we have carbon monoxide multiplied by 0.012, NOx multiplied by 0.78 and SO2 kg multiplied by 1.2, and that comes out to be 0.0024. And human toxicity is in terms of kg for dB equivalent. Okay. And your similarly for your acidification, you do amount of NOx multiplied by 0.7, SO2 multiplied by 1, and that gives us 0.0117. So, your actual impact in each category, in each impact categories is dependent both on the quantity of your emissions and the characterization factor. So, I multiply the amount by the characterization factor and I get the impact in that particular category. So, that is what is the step of characterization, which is mainly taking the characterization factor that quantifies the impact of your LCI into that impact category and multiplying by the total amount of that LCI component with each of its characterization factor and calculate the total impact. It's very straightforward. All you need to know is the characterization factor, and this is what we calculate from our LCA. Okay. So, the end point indicator, after you have characterization in midpoint categories, you can stop there. So, most of the LCA analysts stop at the midpoint indicator because the focus has been on global warming potential or climate change or acidification or those kind of things. But if you want to go further, there are 3 endpoint categories that are being recognized. One is the human health. What this endpoint indicator talks about, it is given in the units of disability adjusted life years, which is known as DALY, and it is given by the World Health Organization. The second one is the ecological impact, which is given in terms of potentially disappeared fraction of ecosystem. So, that is self-explainable, that it is talking about how we are damaging the ecosystem, and that is the ecological impact in terms of vanishing of the ecosystems. And then we have resource depletion, which has multiple ways, but one of the ways is the marginal cost increase of extraction, and we will see these endpoint indicators. So, LCI to LCIA, we already talked that for impact in a particular impact category is calculated by the general formula where I is the total impact, and you have CFI, which is the characterization factor for each of your emissions or resource consumption, and it is multiplied by the mass, that is the total mass or volume of the ith LCI component. Once you have calculated the mass from the process network algebra that we saw, and then you just multiply by characterization factor, you can calculate impact in each category. So, this is mostly an example of showing how we are converting LCI to LCIA. So, this is here you will see all the LCI components, and you have, so here on the top you can see the midpoint impact category. So, CC means climate change, OD is ozone depletion, human toxicity, POF, PMF, and infrared radiation and terrestrial acidification. And then for each of the impact categories you will also see the impact, the units that are being used. So, climate change is in kg CO2 equivalent, your ozone depletion is in kg CFZ and henceforth. And there is, for each of those impact, you just multiply your, you have these characterization factors that are telling that if I have these components, then what is the characterization factor. One thing I want to highlight is that if you see, you have benzene and you have different characterization factor for benzene, and the reason being is that you see that here there is a term called compartment and there is a term called subcompartment. So, if you have an benzene emission, it can go to your air, it can go to water. Whether your benzene is emitted to air or whether it is emitted to water, it will have different impact, and that is what this compartment is actually capturing. So, when you are doing your LCA and you have your LCI, if you have, you need to collect the detail of whether my emissions is going to air or water. If it is going to air, then you will have a different characterization factor that you use. If it is going to water, you have a different characterization factor. So, when you look at the characterization factor provided, you see that which one is mapping to your LCI to actually use the right characterization factor. The next thing is the subcompartment. So, you can see in subcompartment there is high population density, low population density, lower stratosphere, and in terms of water it is talking about groundwater, lake, ocean. Okay. That also indicates that what will be the potential impact. If you have benzene emitted to air in a high population density area, which means that it will have much higher human toxicity. See, for high population density we have 1.35 characterization factor, but low population density it is only 0.36. That means that when you have a high population density and your air quality is bad, the human toxicity is actually higher. hence the characterization factor is also higher. So, you might have a lower emissions of benzene in a high population density area in air. It might have much higher impact on human toxicity than a higher amount of benzene in a low population density area. So, this is actually capturing also the aspect of actual exposure to the population. So, whenever you are doing this characterization of LCI to LCIA, you would, when you go to your characterization models or when you go to your life cycle impact assessment, you would look for these details of where which particular category your emissions match. If you will have to collect that information, of course, if you have available for your processes. Most of the time it is not available, and hence what we do is we do an average calculation. We might take an average characterization factor and just say this might be the potential impact. But there are these level of details available for your impact assessment models that you may want to use if you have an actual detailed information for each of your life cycle inventory components. Okay. So, we have now different LCIA methodologies that use different characterization models, and based on LCIA methodology you select, the impact categories will differ. What this timeline shows the evolution of different impact assessment methods that have happened over the years. Okay. So, your different LCIA methodologies use different characterization models, and this slide shows the evolution of different methods. In next modules, we will go over one of the examples for LCI to LCIA, and then we will look into each of these methods and see what impact categories these include, so that you can make the right decision of using the right LCIA model for your study.